The war in Gaza has proven to be another one of those moments in history where the world has to pick a side. You're either with Israel or you're with Palestine. The last moment like this was very, very recent, the war in Ukraine. The perception was that the entire world has rallied up against Russia. Everyone is against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, the reality was very, very different. With regards to condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the UN, 35 countries voted to abstain. Very, very interestingly, these 35 countries include China, India, and South Africa. They represent more than 50% of the world's population. So essentially, the countries which represent more than 50% of the world's population voted to abstain from condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Even though some of the Western countries could have political interests in defending Ukraine's position, the narrative was different. And the narrative was, how can you invade a democratic country? How can you invade Ukraine? With this discussion, a question arises, and a very, very important question indeed. These values which caused the West to defend Ukraine's position, where are those values now? Where are those values in the case of Gaza? The beginning of the conflict in Gaza has had serious implications for the West's Ukrainian war. Much of the Ukrainian war budget coming from countries like the United States of America has now had to be split between Ukraine and Israel. However, it has not only been difficult for financial reasons, it has also been difficult from a narrative perspective. Many have been quick to point out the glaring hypocrisy in the two cases. The President of the European Commission, von der Leyen, has been slammed for her double standards. Here she is speaking in 2022.
Civilian infrastructure with a clear aim to cut off men, women, children of water, electricity and heating. With the winter coming, these are acts of pure terror. And we have to call it as such.
You may assume by her words that she's describing Israel. To answer your question, she was not describing Israel. She was actually describing Russia. All we have heard from her since the beginning of this conflict is Israel has a right to defend itself. She has since, of course, still been actively rallying up support for the Ukrainian cause. Whilst the American President Joe Biden spoke so heartily regarding Ukrainian lives, mentioning and vowing that we will stand with you for as long as it takes,
because we're going to stand with you as long as it takes.
We have the case of John Kirby, who mentioned that the American policy is still that there are no red lines for Israel in the assault on Gaza. He said this despite 10,000 civilians having lost their lives.
In late October, you had referred to the fact that the administration is not drawing any red lines for Israel. As the death toll for civilians in the Gaza Strip has gone up, I wanted to ensure, is that still the case, that the administration has no red lines?
That is still the case.
We also have the case of Keir Starmer. When asked about the Israelis cutting off food and electricity to the Gazan civilians, he seems to endorse collective punishment upon the Gazans. It seems that everything that was a crime in Ukraine, if done by Israel, is perfectly fine. We see double standard in the treatment of the West towards freedom of speech. For example, domestically within the West, we have seen France embark upon campaigns to defame the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In 2020, when caricatures were shown on French government buildings, we had the case of Emmanuel Macron. How did he respond to these things? He responded by mentioning and acknowledging that these things may cause shock for the Muslims of the world. However, he has to defend the right to freedom of speech, freedom to draw, freedom to think, what he also described as freedom to blaspheme. With all of these aforementioned points, some may find it strange, but last week 14 French senators would submit a bill attempting to criminalize anti-Semitism. Amongst other things, the bill proposed 2 years in prison with a €75,000 fine for insulting Israel. One wonders what happened to freedom of speech. In the UK, there is currently a flare-up over Armistice Day. One wonders what has happened to the right to protest. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has referred to these marches as hate marches. Additionally, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, also expressed support for postponing the march. It should be noted that in the French case, The conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism seems to also be the narrative that is being pushed by the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, in the UK. What has happened to freedom of speech? What has happened to the right to protest? What has happened to the right to freedom of assembly? Pro-Palestinian activists say in response that the march taking place on Armistice Day is calling for a ceasefire for a situation that the UN has referred to as an unfolding catastrophe. In conclusion, the hypocrisy at play signals alarms for a liberal world order that has been teetering on decline since 9/11. The double standards that people are pointing out between Ukraine and Gaza and the massacres that are taking place in Gaza might just be the straw that break the back of liberal internationalism.